Well, welcome everybody for joining us today. We very happy to be part of this RAIC industry knowledge hub. Today we gonna talk a little bit about making wayfinding journey accessible. The topic of inclusivity and accessibility is an important part of our work, and we would like to take today's chance and share some of the things we've learned to all of you. For those who don't know, myself and Michelle are from a place called Entro. We are an international interdisciplinary design firm. Our office was established in Montreal in 1966. We have offices here in Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, New York, Sydney, and Zurich. We have about just over 55 people in our team.
Yeah, and our team spans a lot of disciplines. We have backgrounds ranging from graphic design to architecture, industrial design, information design, even neuroscience, with research playing an important role in our work.
So here's our group of designers. You can see myself and Michelle here as well. My name is Edmund Li. I'm an associate at Entro. I have been in the design industry for over 20 years. I'm an active member at the RGD and at the SEGD. I am also one of the co-authors of the RGD Accessibility 2, a practical handbook on accessible graphic design. Creating design programs that are accessible to all is an important aspect to my design philosophy.
I'm Michelle Parrish, creative director at Entro. About 15 years experience in signage and wayfinding programs, branded environments, donor recognition and interpretive. I've been passionate about addressing unique needs for various communities, especially with accessibility and inclusivity. So that comes into play in our work when there are projects that have multiple languages and all systems that require accessibility.
At Entro, we are, our mission is to connect people to place. We want to give places identity and meaning. We create design that are practical and beautiful. We want to make everybody's daily life experience more inspirational.
Ultimately, yeah, we are a place branding and experiential design firm. So just to recap what that means, I know it's a term that can have some variety in the meaning and is fairly new, but experiential design for us really is about designing environments with the intent to shape people's everyday experience. So helping to create design solutions for the built environment. And to speak a little bit about accessibility, what really drives this for us is this idea of really considering ability to be a spectrum. It's an important thought, we think, because rather than grouping people necessarily into categories and then searching for the solutions, thinking about people on this spectrum with our abilities constantly changing throughout our lives. So considering, for example, that when we are children and when we are designing environments where children will be part of it, you know, the reading height is different, the reach distance is different, cognitive abilities and language skills may be different. As we age, mobility and cognitive functions, reach distances again, and sight may change. Or if we get an injury, there may be a shift in our abilities and how we navigate space. And even as parents, my first experience with a stroller in a subway system was a very challenging and eye-opening experience. So, you know, putting ourselves in the shoes of any of these groups of people, because at some point in our lives, we may experience this. We will experience spaces around us very differently. So really making wayfinding accessible to all. It's sort of an invitation to all of us to do the right thing and to think outside the box.
And absolutely, we wanted to make sure that wayfinding is accessible to everybody. And before we talk about how we can make wayfinding accessible, let's just briefly touch on what is wayfinding. Wayfinding includes all of the ways which people orient themselves in a physical space and when they're navigating from place to place. And that includes, when people are using their sight, trying to look for cues in an architectural space, they look for landmarks, they read the signs. And people may use the sense of touch. They may be using braille and tactile signage, helping to guide their way. Maybe the change of texture on the floor. So let's say if the floor finishes changes and people realize that, hey, like I'm now exiting from this place and entering into another. And we use sound and smell to help us navigate as well. Just imagine yourself being in looking for a food court, and you're smelling, you're trying to get the sense of smell, and you as you get closer and closer to a food court and you hear the noise and you smell the food and you understand that, hey, I'm getting closer to the place I needed to go. And then as wayfinding designers, we generally provide wayfinding information to people in two ways. One way is providing linear wayfinding, so that's directing people from point to point, giving step-by-step instructions. So imagine yourself following instructions using your Google Map, and that would be considered linear wayfinding. And then there's spatial wayfinding. So, that's when one is looking for their way using a more holistic manner. So think about yourself looking at a map. You can generally imagine that, hey, like if I follow that direction, I'm gonna get to my destination. But the kind of specific routes and when to turn, maybe not as clear, but you get a general sense of where you're gonna be and where you wanted to go.
Just to interrupt for a second, Edmund, I think it's important to note that we're not saying that either one of these is better than the other. It's that considering both of them in any signage program or any program for a building or a town, for example, is very important, because people do think about wayfinding very differently, and people find their ways using mental maps, for example, or signs, but also a combination of those. So including both of those types, linear and spatial wayfinding, is very important.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there are a lot of things that wayfinding signage itself cannot solve. So we see that, we'd like to think that wayfinding is not just signage. So the moment you started planning your trip, you at home, you going online looking for directions to go from where you are to the place you wanted to be. Your wayfinding journey already started. And there are a lot of things that signage alone cannot fix. So, those who are architects, imagine if the architectural space itself is not well designed, and perhaps the spatial connection is convoluting, and people are not really clear where they could be going. There are things that signage will not be able to fix. And so if we can talk a little bit about the basics for accessible wayfinding. Accessible wayfinding must be logical and easy to understand. So regardless of the person's cognitive, language, mobility, and visual abilities, directions needs to be able to be understood. So we would like to think about all the ways that people may be, navigating within a space, and how we can make that experience helpful to everybody. And we start with providing logic to a space. So obviously, the physical space itself must be logical to begin with. and then we would put a layer of logic to the space. And this is a very interesting photograph we took from one of the recent project we visited before we started working on the project. And you can look at the floor numbers in here. It's not very logical unless you already know which floor you're on and the kind of general sequencing of the space. This could be very tricky for people to navigate.
So really finding that clarity, I think, for first-time users. And regardless of the local dialect, we have some options on this page that we're showing with French language, but really creating that distinction between above ground and below ground, and a clear naming system that people can relate to, that is familiar and that is logical to help them find their way. The same thing with floor numbering. One thing that comes into play with numbering within a building are similarities with how we number in civic projects on a street, for example. If you're walking up or down a street, the sequence, obviously, with odd on one side and even on the other, as you progress, is very logical. You know what to expect and you know how to find the place that you're looking for. So the same thing with room numbers. If you look at that example of number 7 in the middle, with a larger room like this, you have to allocate a few numbers. There's always the potential for future renovations, for example, if a room gets broken down into smaller sequencing. So think of it sort of as the larger house on the block that might be zoned differently in the future. So the same thing goes with room numbering.
Yeah, we want to start the sequencing and the logic from the point of entry. So when you enter the space, there's a relation to how you come into that space. And once you put a logic to the space, connecting floors horizontally, then we would like to find a way to help make the space more memorable. So think of strategically placing a landmark into a location where decisions are being made. That would really help people provide instructions.
Great. So for clear messaging, this is an important piece of the wayfinding experience for people is how the information is presented to them, what the nomenclature is, and really, again, the intent is to keep this as simple as possible and not overwhelm people. As an example that we have in front of us right now is from a hospital. Navigating a hospital is often a very high stress situation. It's sometimes a situation where people are looking for something very quickly or maybe unfamiliar with the language. And it's a language that has a lot of nuances in it that are very particular, obviously. So, keeping the list as simple as possible. One of the things that we do early at the start is to work with the team to figure out ways to do that so that the naming is something very clear. So for example, you'll see here, Children's Ophthalmology Clinic. We might recommend changing that to Child Eye Clinic, something that's shorter on the signage, less overwhelming, and easier to understand. When possible, we'll use pictograms as well. So you'll notice a few names that we can eliminate entirely in certain situations and use only a universal pictogram so that people can, again, understand it quickly.
Yeah, we're using the simple language, concise messaging to help break the barrier of language and to prevent overloading cognitive function for people who may find it stressful. Now, once the nomenclature is clear, we need to have some sort of information hierarchy when we are presenting these messages. So this example in here, we have our directing hierarchy set up so that you would show always the Hinsey Hall, which is a great room in this museum, that will always go on top. And then any kind of exhibit galleries that are following could be second in priority. And then any kind of like larger important amenities such as the theater, the classroom, the members' lounge, those kind of things would follow after that. And then we would have our pictograms, and we would have this rule that, whenever we have pictograms in here, in this particular program, we don't show text messaging. So this way, everything is a little bit easier for people to follow. And any other additional information relating to how you can get from one place to another would always be last. Never underestimate the power of symbols. So with this project, we were trying to create an icon for the theater space. The designer really loved the idea of using a vintage icon. They are simple, they are easy to read, but we have to ask ourselves, is this clear? Does that mean the same thing to everyone who may be coming into this museum? So we did this very non-scientific experiment with my kids and asked them, what do they think these symbols mean? And their answers surprised us a little. So you can see from the far right, our vintage movie reel is in fact a pencil sharpeners for the next generation. So this really prompted us to, question and rethink some of the meanings for icons that we are using a lot in a daily basis. So that includes the symbol for toilets. For inclusive reasons, a lot of people are now debating with this hot topics for pictograms. Should we be focusing onto the function of the room, or should we be really focusing onto the users of the room? And we have done a lot of research with this, and with the feedback with transgender communities, we really feel that focusing onto the function of the room is a lot more clear. There's no argument about the function of this room if we're using the fixture of the toilet. And at the same time, this symbol would be gender neutral. So figure that. In some institutions, there might be a need for not using pictos, and in that case, maybe having a clear message is enough. And we're gonna pass to Michelle and talk a little bit about making these messaging clear.
So legibility here for the actual visual and tactile elements is something that's at the forefront of the design process when we're looking at the signage here. Starting, very simply with the fonts, the font choices. ADA has requirements, AODA has requirements. They differ a little bit per country for tactile elements especially. But the recommendation really is always that especially for tactile, it's more than a recommendation, but even for visual characteristics, sans serif fonts have a much better ability to be read. The weight and the thickness of the font is another thing. So the proportions of your characters, the thickness of the letter form, the space between lettering is all something that has to be carefully assessed to determine which fonts would work. And then even looking, studies that we may do to look at the actual letter forms and shapes and how they work. It's always different for particular projects, but the examples that you can see on this page for maybe the letter uppercase B and the number 8 are very similar in some fonts and have better legibility or stand out from each other in others, or 5 versus uppercase S at the bottom. So really looking at these nuances and how they play out together. Again, for certain tactile elements, depending on the country and the code requirements, uppercase may be required for some, or upper and lowercase. But for visual characteristics, the way that the letter form varies in upper and lowercase is something that is much more legible. The way that our brains read these letters and sort of have an immediate grasp when you look at the word on the top, that it has form, it has character, it has shape, that you start to recognize quickly. Of course, the size is important. Again, there are certain characteristics that need to be adhered to for different code requirements, but looking at differences depending on what type of space you're in and how you might access the sign. If you can get close to it, if you're looking at something very high up and farther away, then your character heights are affected. And the contrast. So high contrast is always better, of course, for legibility. 70% contrast is still the recommendation. The guidelines are slightly different. Black text on a white background is easily read. White text on a black background, slightly larger. So considering, if you're really needing to boost that legibility, how do you do it with contrast? And also how do you do that with color? Adding color to a signage program is something that does not affect whether or not you can achieve your tonal values to get that contrast, but you have to be very careful about what the difference is with your hues as well as the saturation and how that might affect how people are reading it. There might be different hues that visually look very different, but when you actually desaturate it, if you don't have the ability to read those colors, they might appear identical. So considering that you might look for different saturation points with the different ranges of colors.
And there's nothing wrong with using color as part of your signage program. There's nothing wrong with using color to differentiate, but it's important to keep in mind the tonal value if you have a different way of reading colors. So if somebody do not see color the same way as we do, make sure that we consider the tonal value in black and white, and make sure that those colors can the differences can be told.
So as an example here, again from a hospital setting, how might color be used really effectively from a wayfinding standpoint in a wayfinding program? The color can be a very strong element for differentiating for zones, for example, like this, but it also has to have a layering of other information. People might read color very, very differently. So having this layering of information where maybe there is a symbol that is also associated with it and a clear word or the lettering at the top, for example, PT for patient tower. So there are different ways of
that redundancy is important.
Yeah, different ways of doing that, but the important thing is to have these pieces of information and to have the layering. So how that might work on a sign, for example, so that it's a visual cue for people, but it can't be relied upon only as color. And we see this in transit and subway systems a lot. And then architecturally, there are ways that, if there's colors that are differentiating zones, for example, in the signage program, this might be something that ties in really clearly with architectural cues as well to help guide people. Yeah,
so if we now have a logical, if the space itself is organized logically, directions are provided clearly, and the signs is legible and it's done in a way that's consistent, that gives us the foundation of clear wayfinding. And with clear wayfinding, it's more accessible to most users. So we talk about, when we are, finding our ways, we needed to utilize all of our sensors. What if we lost some of those sensors? What if we never have one of these sensors to begin with? So to look at a fully accessible wayfinding journey, we need to ask ourselves some of those things. Currently, if you look at this list of standards that are used fairly common in Canada and in North America, none of these standards would request us to provide directionals in tactile or in braille.
You cut out there for a minute.
And sorry.
Sorry, you just cut out there for a minute. So I just want to make sure that that was clear, that the types of directionals that Edmund's talking about are signage, signage directionals, that these are not required to have tactile and braille in any of these.
Right. So if you consider the wayfinding journey, currently with all of those standards that we just looked at, the general basics is you need to provide tactile and braille information at the end of the wayfinding journey. So that's when you arrived. When you already arrived to your destination, in front of the room, you need to provide this room ID with tactile information to confirm that you have arrived. So if I'm a user and I needed that information to take me there, how did I get there in the first place? Are there things that we can do to help people guide their way along? Would there be things that we can add to the program to make sure that the entire journey is accessible? So some of the things that we could add in here includes, providing tactile map, braille along the journey as well. And how do we do that? What are some of the ways that we can do these days?
So looking at, how do we push the accessible journey so that it is above and beyond the code requirements that need to be met and can really kind of complete that full accessible journey. In other countries, as an example, in Japan, this is a lot more common to have a tactile pathway, to have tactile maps. So including things like that, as Edmund was saying, kind of help you get from point A to point B without asking for directions along the way. Tactile elements on handrails are something that, again, it's not a requirement by code, but it's a way of adding that element along the journey. Confirmation, short messages where there can be confirmation that you're moving in the right direction, for example. And advents in 3D printing and different technologies that are coming into play now for tactile elements can really help a lot of our projects, just because they are changing so fast, and they have the ability, if they're done correctly, to be much more financially viable for expanding that program. So, whether it's exterior or interior, really simple ways that signage can just be adapted to include that information. Elevator directories, for example, or elevator call button panels, certain elements are required by code to have that tactile and braille, but not all of them. And so pushing that a little bit further than is required can really bridge that gap. Other ways as well to have added elements in a signage program, whether the information is included or not on the sign. Sometimes just knowing that the sign is there and knowing that the information is there can be challenging. So the example on the left here, where there's a little bit of a notch cut into the sign here, it's a cue again, so that people, if you're running your hand along that sign, that this is where the information is that you can read. Having other technology as well, where there's maybe an audio feed, applying audio as another layer in that wayfinding journey or interpretive journey can be quite useful.
So recently we worked on a few projects when the client asked us to go to aim beyond the accessibility baseline requirements. So this project that we're showing in here is the National Veterans Resource Center for the Syracuse University. A lot of veterans came back home with a new disability. The university wants to address that and make sure the users feel comfortable when they're using this building. And just in general, the university also would like to do a little bit more than what the ADA requirement there in the States is asking people to do. So one of the things that we try in here is at the point of arrival, adding an element to bring people to the entrance. So connecting users from the accessible parking space with tactile pathway leading them to the entrance, and then from the entrance to the reception desk. Now these desks are mostly unmanned, so 90% of the time there's no one there. In order to help them understand where they are, we added another element to the program. So when you arrive to the reception desk, there is a tactile map just clarifying the general layout of the building to the users who are coming into the place. And this is one way to help people understand the general layout for the building. So now you have an overview of the building. You can think about how you can travel to places. With the directionals within the building, we turn the directional messaging into tactile messaging, so people can read with their fingers. And at the same time, with this building, one of the characteristics is they have a lot of accessible ramp connecting the two parts of the building. So we took advantage of that, and we added Braille messaging onto the safety handrail. So that way people could also learn a little bit more about how to move around in the building. So the next example we're showing in here is the Australian Museum. Now the building code and the accessible requirement in Australia is quite a bit different than what we have here in North America. What is required there is that along the accessible path, all of the directional messaging must be provided in tactile and Braille. So that includes the traffic flow for inside the museum, as well as all of the exterior signs that is outside of the museum. We also, on this example, you can see that right next to the icon for each one of the exhibit gallery, there's this little icon that shows different numbers of bars, and that is to highlight the sensory exposure one may be facing when you come into that place. So for those who are super sensitive to sensory exposure, and you may get a seizure, or you may feel just very sick when your sensories are being overloaded. This gives you an understanding of the kind of risk you may be facing when you come into that space. Throughout the building, including the exterior, this is an example showing how the Braille is incorporated to the directional signage. With directional signage, there is a little bit of a trickiness to it, because there's usually this recommendation of the reach distance. So there's a zone that is recommended for where touchable signs could be placed.
Yeah, so you can see that tactile zone with the blue dotted line is not a very large area. So it's one of the reasons that some of the other elements that we were talking about, with your nomenclature being as simplified and as possible, and using pictograms instead of long messaging, can really tie into the full effectiveness of a program, so that you don't want to end up with a sign that has so many messages that you can't apply it into tactile and Braille, for example.
Yeah, the importance of concise messaging. So when you arrive to the entrance of the museum, we have a sign just announcing the arrival with tactile and Braille. Of course, this is a requirement for having signage throughout the accessible journey. Like we mentioned previously, there are things that is beyond signage that has to be done to ensure that the space is accessible to all. So throughout these signs would be connected with accessible ramps, and those are obviously things that the architectural team can help to do. So with this example you're looking at in here, these are the interior tactile directionals along the accessible path. And you'll notice in this example that in Australia, their requirement is a little bit more extensive than ours. You will probably notice those examples on the left-hand side. Those are symbols that are quite common here in North America. But the two on the far right, those are built for, they're used for ambulant toilets. So what these really are is toilet stores that are equipped with handrail, whether they are on the left-hand side, or on the right-hand side, or on both sides. For the signage program, we need to indicate which side of those help are provided, and also within the toilet itself, we need to show which cubicle has those type of help, so that people would understand where to go. Within the lift in the museum, in addition to just making each one of the level numbering indicated in tactile and braille, we also highlighted the general offerings for each floor in high contrast and in tactile and braille, so those who are visually impaired could have a general sense of where they could go once they get into the lift. And with this last example, for this program, we built into a series of maps showing visitors who are coming into the museum, all of the spaces within the building that they can go to. That you would notice that the floor plates for each one of these floors are the same. It's a general requirement for building indoor Google Maps. So in addition to all of those additional examples that we show for accessibility features, once the indoor Google Map is activated, people would also have another way of finding their ways if they needed that extra help. So what we would like to do to conclude our presentation is to invite everybody here to think outside the box when you are trying to create this accessible wayfinding journey to users for buildings that you might be designing. For those who notice, if you look at the dollar bills that we have in our pocket, there's braille information on it. Those are not your typical braille. They're not standard braille. If you look specifically on each one of these bills, you'll find that the dollar value for these bills are indicated in a way that is a little bit different than what you normally would expect. So for those who know, numbers and letters in braille are exactly identical. So number 1, 2, 3, 4 is indicated the same way as A, B, C, D. There's a special character to indicate what you are reading later on, if that is letters or if that is numbers. So you can, as you can imagine, it could be a little bit tricky if you have a larger amount versus a smaller amount. You have to read if it's a number or if it's a typical message. That's a lot of things for people to comprehend when you trying to quickly count your bills. So what the Canadian government decided to do is, hey, let's think about the user experience. Maybe that's too tricky. Maybe that's not very helpful. Let's do something different. So what they did in here is 6 dots in Braille is a cell, and they are using 1 cell to identify a $5 bill, 2 cells to identify $10, 3 for 20, and so on and so forth. So this way, if you are at the cashier, you're trying to count your bills, and you can really do it quickly. What we are trying to use this example for is to just kind of show people that maybe when you are designing spaces for people to use, if you want to make it all accessible to everybody, think about the user experience. Think a little bit outside of the box. Don't just try to be adhering to the code, and let's see what we can do more.
So that concludes our presentation for today, everybody. Thank you so much. We are open for questions. If anybody would like to type questions into the chat here, we're happy to answer anything that we've gone through. We have one question coming in here. Do we have a good resource for gender neutral signage?
I'd say yes.
It's an interesting question. It's a hot topic for sure. It's one that we talk about quite a lot in our work, and that it does differ a little bit from project to project for sure, and on what the type of building is and what the requirements are. I think as Edmund said, we have done a lot of research and have been working with different communities that are involved in this sort of discovery process along the way. One of the things that has become very important is this idea of identifying the function of the room rather than the nature of the person who is using it, so as not to put emphasis on who might use this room, but really just what is this room for. I think some of the sorry, go ahead, Edmund.
In terms of resources, I think our office do have a white paper with this topic, which you can download from our website. I would invite everybody to take a look at that. Like Michelle was saying, I think we generally would support showing the function of the washroom itself. I think, especially with the topic of gender neutral, a lot of times when we approach those who are transgender or in the process of the transformation, we often see those signs that shows the kind of half man, half woman. We did find in our study that they became, the impression, the feeling of it is quite negative to the transgender community. They wanted to either see themselves as male or female. That is their goal. Showing that kind of half man, half woman symbolism isn't as comfortable to some of those users as you might think.
And many users might not identify with a gender at all, or might not want to be identified as being split, for example, or not whole. So there's a lot of nuances to it, as well as the actual terminology, whether even saying gender neutral signage can spark debate. Having that as universally acceptable to everybody, I think is an important conversation to have with all the stakeholders and the client team as well.
We have a question from Christina Lee. What do you find most challenging in your current work, and how can architects and interior designers help to make wayfinding easier and better? Do you want to go first, Michelle?
Sure. Yeah, I think we'll both have different takes on this. There's a lot of different challenges, that we've talked about today in terms of making a journey accessible. I think that one of the one of the biggest challenges is when there's a disconnect in the timing or the communication, which is sometimes something that's a little bit out of everybody's control, depending on how far, for example, the architecture has progressed, or if it's a building that has the inability to adapt in certain ways. So, and maybe the signage consultants come in at a later time. So there are disconnects that can sometimes happen that we can't control. But I think that having this open communication as early as possible with all of the teams is something that is really key to making that wayfinding easier throughout the whole journey. We showed some examples of things that really need the architectural team, for example, and the signage team to be on board together and working towards the same goals. Like when you think about that example of color and how that might be used in a signage program, but how the architecture and the lighting consultants might all be contributing to the experience so that that holistic experience can be really positive for the users.
I think, Michelle, you touched on a lot of great points, including lighting. So I think one of the most common thing that we found for an inaccessible signage program is you do have a sign, but the clarity of the sign, the contrast of the sign changes whether it's lit properly or not. So coordinating to allow those signs to be properly lit would be helpful. The other thing that we have as a challenge, I guess, I don't know if challenge is the best way. I think maybe working together is definitely the scenario. When we are suggesting those solutions to have a tactile pathway leading people from the outside of the building to either a point of reception or a directory place for information, so people can get an overview of the building. Those are typically not they're not considered as part of a signage program. They are typically provided as part of the base building. So although the wayfinding consultant could help to identify these type of possibilities, the budget usually comes from the base building. So if the architect is willing to work together and find those type of solutions, identify them, and then to kind of promote them, then there's a higher chance that those things could be done to a program. I think that is all the questions. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so glad you could all join. This is a really important topic, and it's something that is, very close to our hearts and all the work that we do on our projects at Entro. So we're very happy that you could join us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.